It wasn't one single tragedy that broke her heart. It was time itself, the slow unraveling of everything she once knew. Margaret couldn't remember the exact day Joy had slipped away. Perhaps it was the day she buried her husband, or maybe years later, when her children moved far, their lives too full to include her in the rhythm of their days. Or perhaps sorrow had crept in quietly, like dust settling on untouched furniture, unnoticed until it covered everything. Each morning she rose from her bed with the same thought, another day to endure. The house was clean, the plants watered, the calendar untouched. Life had become routine, but not living, only existing. Her heart carried a dull ache that no doctor could treat. It wasn't loneliness exactly, nor despair, just an endless heaviness. Even laughter from the street outside seemed to reach her dulled ears as if through water. She had once been the kind of woman who brightened rooms. Now she could barely brighten her own eyes in the mirror. Time passed, and sorrow became her shadow, always beside her, never leaving, always whispering, "You're still here, but for what?" There was a time when Margaret found beauty everywhere. The morning dew on roses, the smell of bread baking, the laughter of children. But now, those same things passed before her without stirring her soul. Her eyes still saw the same world, but it was as if someone had drained the color out of it. Even sunlight seemed pale, weak. She went through the motions of living, making breakfast, folding laundry, watering her plants. But her heart moved slower than her body. Music no longer reached her. Books gathered dust. The birds outside her window still sang, but their melody sounded like a memory instead of a joy. Sometimes she caught herself staring at the wall for long minutes, realizing she hadn't thought of anything at all, just drifted through the emptiness. The world had not changed, but grief has a way of dimming the light, not outside but within, and so she lived in grayness, a muted existence where even beauty seemed like a stranger. The mornings were always the hardest. The stillness before the world awoke made her feel even more alone. She would sit by the window, the same spot where she once drank coffee beside her husband, and watch the light crawl across the floor. The smell of coffee no longer comforted her. It only reminded her of absence. Outside, life stirred. Children heading to school, neighbors greeting one another, cars starting down the street, the hum of a living world that no longer seemed to include her. Her body moved automatically, preparing breakfast, feeding the stray cat that often appeared at her door, tidying the same things she'd tidied the day before. But inside, she felt detached, as if watching herself from afar. She often thought of heaven in those moments, not as escape, but as rest. She didn't wish for death. She just longed for peace, for meaning, for something to remind her that her life wasn't merely the slow fading of light. "Lord," she would whisper sometimes, "I don't need miracles. I just want to feel alive again." Margaret's home was filled with memories that refused to leave. The photographs on the walls told the story of a full life, smiling faces, birthdays, anniversaries, moments once vibrant now frozen behind glass. Each frame carried a whisper, "You were loved once." She dusted them carefully each week, not because anyone would notice, but because it felt wrong to let them fade. Sometimes she spoke softly to them, "You remember this day?" pretending someone might answer. The weight of the years was not in her bones, but in her heart. Too many goodbyes, too many empty chairs, too many echoes of laughter that now existed only in memory. There were moments when she almost envied those already gone, not out of despair, but because they had reached the rest she still longed for. She closed her eyes one night and whispered, "Lord, you've kept me here for so long, but for what? I don't understand anymore." The question hung in the darkness, unanswered, yet somehow sacred. Every evening, Margaret set 2 plates on the table before realizing again that one would remain untouched. It had become a habit she couldn't break, a quiet, daily act of remembrance. The chair across from her stayed empty, but she kept it that way intentionally. She said it helped her pretend he was still near, that he might walk in any moment asking about dinner, smiling the way he always did when the smell of stew filled the house. The silence at the table was both her comfort and her torment. She would talk softly while eating, telling him about her day, the weather, the neighbor's new dog, the news she had read. It wasn't madness, only longing shaped into routine. Sometimes she would reach across the table and rest her hand where his had once been. The wood felt cold under her fingers. "Another day, love," she whispered. "Another day gone by." And though she knew he wouldn't answer, she always paused, as if hoping heaven might allow him a single word back. But there was only stillness, the kind that echoes, the kind that stays. Through her window, life went on. Children running, neighbors chatting, couples walking hand in hand. The sound of it used to make her smile. Now, it simply reminded her of distance. Once she was part of that world, organizing gatherings, helping in the church kitchen, tending the garden with friends. But as the years passed and faces changed, she began to fade from the picture. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls slowed. People loved her, yes, but from afar. She told herself she didn't mind. "I've had my time," she would say. Yet each night, as she heard the distant murmur of voices and laughter, a small ache stirred in her chest. It wasn't envy. It was simply the ache of being outside of life, watching it continue without her, as though she were a story already finished, while the world kept writing new chapters. There were days when she wondered if she had simply become invisible, not because people stopped seeing her, but because she stopped believing she mattered enough to be seen. And that thought, quiet and dangerous, began to whisper to her more often, "You are forgotten." It was near midnight when the question finally escaped her lips. She sat in her armchair, her Bible open but unread, her eyes fixed on the small flame of a candle flickering on the table. The shadows moved softly across the walls, like old memories dancing where laughter once lived. Her voice came weak, trembling, almost afraid of being heard. "Why am I still here, Lord? Everyone I loved is with you now. Why keep me behind?" She waited, the silence pressing against her like the weight of years. She wasn't bitter, only weary. There's a kind of tiredness that no sleep can fix, the fatigue of living too long after your heart has broken too many times. She clasped her hands and whispered again, "If there's a reason, show me. Please show me." But heaven gave no answer that night, only the same soft quiet that filled her house every evening. Still, somewhere deep inside, something tiny flickered, a spark, faint but alive. The prayer had not vanished. It had been heard. The days that followed were heavy. Nothing changed. The same chair, the same empty rooms, the same ache in her chest. Margaret still prayed, but the words had lost their shape. They became sighs, breaths, half-sentences that dissolved into the air. "You know, Lord," she would whisper. "You know." At times she felt guilty for her weariness. She had been a woman of faith all her life, strong, steady, hopeful, but now her hope felt thin, her faith like a small candle flickering in the wind. She no longer asked for happiness, only meaning. Something to prove she hadn't been forgotten by heaven too. Yet even as she felt alone, something unseen began to stir. The silence was not empty, it was waiting, the same way soil waits in winter, holding seeds that will one day break open with life. And though she couldn't feel it yet, the change she longed for had already begun, not in her world, but in her heart. That evening the sorrow became too heavy to hide behind quiet strength. The weight she had carried for years pressed upon her chest until she couldn't breathe. Margaret sank to her knees beside her bed, not to perform a prayer, but to collapse into one. Her voice came out raw, barely more than a whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Lord. I can't keep pretending I'm fine." Tears fell freely, the kind that come from years of holding everything inside. She pressed her hands against the mattress, trembling as the confession poured out. "I've tried to be strong. I've tried to believe. But I wake every day and feel nothing. I'm tired of the silence, tired of living without joy. If you still see me, if you still care, please do something. Change something." Her body shook. Her words ran out. She stayed there in the dark, sobbing until she could no longer make a sound, and when all the tears were gone, she whispered the last fragments of a prayer. "Don't leave me like this, Jesus, please." Then she fell asleep, not knowing that heaven had already begun to move. The world outside her window slept, but in her heart something had awakened. It began as warmth, faint at first, like sunlight filtering through clouds. Her breathing slowed. Her body, so tense from years of holding sorrow, began to loosen. She wasn't dreaming, she wasn't imagining, she was being visited. It wasn't a vision of light or sound, it was presence, quiet, certain, alive. Her room, still and dark, seemed to glow with a peace that didn't come from any lamp. Her chest filled with something she hadn't felt in so long she barely recognized it. Comfort. For a moment, she thought of sitting up, of speaking, but she didn't need to. There were no words, only awe. Tears returned, but this time they didn't burn. They washed, they healed, they said everything she couldn't. And in the depth of her stillness, a whisper passed through her soul, tender as breath. "I am here, Margaret." Her heart stilled. The silence was no longer heavy. It was holy. Margaret had spent years begging for her sadness to be taken away. But that night, something greater happened. It was filled. Jesus did not erase her sorrow. He stepped into it. She felt it in her chest, in her trembling hands, in the tears that fell quietly down her cheeks. It was as if he sat beside her on the same floor where she had knelt in despair and whispered without words, "You are not broken beyond repair." For the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to escape the pain. She allowed it to rest in his hands, and as she did, sorrow changed shape. It became softer, lighter, almost sacred. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time had no meaning in that moment. All she knew was that she was not alone. The same Jesus who had wept at the tomb of Lazarus now wept with her, not to remove the pain, but to redeem it. And when she finally rose to her feet, she felt it, the unmistakable quiet of being seen. She didn't hear it with her ears, but the words were so clear she could have sworn they were spoken aloud. They settled deep into her soul, each one like light breaking through shadow. "I am here. I have not wasted your days." Her breath caught. All these years she had seen her life as empty, days of sorrow, years of silence, decades of loss. But now she understood. None of it had been wasted. Every tear, every ache, every quiet prayer had been seen. She pressed her hand to her heart, trembling. "You were with me all along," she whispered, and the presence around her seemed to glow even warmer, not demanding, not distant, but patient, waiting for her to believe it. Her grief had not ended, but it had been transformed. For the first time she realized that even her pain had purpose. It had been the place where he chose to meet her. In the days that followed, Margaret began to remember, not with bitterness, but with wonder. It was as if every memory she had once labeled as sad now shimmered with hidden light. She thought of the night she lost her husband, how in her anguish a stranger had come to sit with her in the hospital hallway without saying a word. That was him. She remembered the years her children had grown distant, and how a neighbor had invited her for tea one morning, just when she thought she couldn't face the day. That was him too. Even in the long stretches of silence, the kind that once felt like abandonment, she began to see his fingerprints. The food that never ran out, the sunsets that had comforted her without her noticing, the peace that had always come, even when she didn't ask for it. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of realization. "You were there, Jesus," she whispered. "Every time I thought I was alone, you were just quiet." And in that revelation, her grief softened into gratitude. The story of her suffering had not been a tale of absence, but of a presence too faithful to leave, even when unseen. When the sun rose that next morning, Margaret noticed it. The light, the warmth, the color. It wasn't that the world had suddenly grown brighter. It was her heart that had cleared enough to see again. The sky seemed more blue, the air sweeter. Even the birds' songs, the ones she had ignored for years, sounded like praise. She made her tea slowly, savoring the aroma, feeling the cup warm her palms. It was such a small thing, but for the first time in so long, it meant something. Her sorrow hadn't disappeared. It still sat quietly in the corners of her soul, but it no longer ruled her. She sat by the window, the same one where she had spent countless mornings lost in emptiness, and whispered, "Thank you for another day." And as she said it, she realized gratitude had returned. That was the first miracle. Jesus hadn't changed her life overnight. He had changed her heart enough to see that life was still sacred. The world hadn't been grey. Her eyes had simply forgotten how to see color. It started with small things, the smell of rain after a storm, the taste of honey in her tea, the softness of her old shawl as she wrapped it around her shoulders. Margaret began to collect moments, tiny treasures of beauty she had once overlooked. Each one felt like a quiet whisper from Jesus saying, "I am still here, still giving, still good." She walked through her garden one morning and saw a small bud blooming in a pot she thought was dead. She smiled. "You too," she said softly. "You came back to life." There was laughter in her again, quiet, gentle laughter that came not from forgetting pain, but from finally seeing beyond it. Her neighbors noticed the change. They said her face looked different, lighter, peaceful, radiant. She didn't tell them everything. She only said, "Jesus has been visiting me." And she meant it, because he had. The days that once dragged now flowed with grace. Margaret began each morning with prayer, not pleading prayers as before, but conversations. She spoke to him as to a friend, telling him about her day, her aches, her hopes. Sometimes she didn't say anything at all, just sat in his presence, breathing peace. In the evenings, she would light a candle and whisper thanks for the smallest things, the warmth of sunlight, the taste of supper, the letter from her granddaughter, the silence that no longer hurt. Even her tears had changed. They still came, but now they were prayers in liquid form, proof that love and pain had become one gentle offering to God. She often said aloud, "You didn't take my sorrow away, Lord. You turned it into worship." Her life had become a hymn, slow, reverent, full of gratitude. She no longer asked why she was still here. She knew. She was here to remember that love remains, even when everything else fades. The long days that once stretched endlessly before her were now her sanctuary. Margaret no longer saw time as something to endure. It had become a gift. Morning sunlight through her curtains felt like a soft visitation. She would whisper, "Good morning, Lord," and smile as if greeting an old friend. The house, though quiet, no longer felt empty. Every corner carried a sense of companionship, the kind that doesn't need to speak to be known. Sometimes she caught herself humming hymns under her breath while cooking or tidying. Other times she would simply sit still, resting her hand over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm of peace that had taken residence there. Loneliness still came to visit, but it no longer stayed. When it knocked, she opened the door and found Jesus already standing there beside her. She realized with tears in her eyes that what she had prayed for all those years, comfort, purpose, companionship, had been answered not by changing her circumstances, but by filling them with himself. Her sorrow had not been wasted. It had been the soil where peace took root. People began to notice. The woman who had once withdrawn into herself now carried a lightness that drew others in. Neighbors who once waved from afar began stopping by for tea. The young mother from next door came often saying, "It just feels peaceful here." Margaret would smile, pouring tea slowly, her movements gentle and unhurried. She didn't speak much of her transformation. She didn't need to. It was visible in her eyes, in her stillness, in the way she listened to others without rushing to fix their pain. Those who left her home always said the same thing. It feels like something sacred lingers there. She never took credit for it. "It's not me," she would say softly. "It's Jesus. He fills the quiet." Her house, once filled with sorrow, had become a refuge, a place where weary hearts could breathe. The world hadn't changed, but Margaret had become a reflection of the one who had changed her. The evening came softly, as all her evenings did. Quiet wind, gentle light, the whisper of trees outside her window. Margaret sat in her chair, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her Bible open on her lap. She read the words she had underlined years ago when her heart was still heavy with grief. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. This time she read them with a smile. She had no fear, only peace. The same presence that had met her in sorrow now filled the room with tender warmth. She felt it before she saw it, before she even closed her eyes. She whispered her final prayer, "Thank you, Jesus, for staying all the way to the end." And as her breathing slowed, the peace deepened until her last sigh became a song only heaven could hear. When her heart stopped, it wasn't death that came, and it was home. When her eyes opened again, everything was light. Not sunlight, but the kind of light that lives. She felt no weight, no ache, no sorrow. Only joy so complete it seemed to sing through her. And there he was. Jesus stood before her, the same voice that had whispered through her tears, the same presence that had filled her loneliness. But now she could see him, his smile, his eyes, the love that had waited patiently for this moment. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Every answer she had ever sought was in his gaze. He reached out his hand and she took it. Steady, strong, whole again. The years of sorrow melted away like mist before the morning sun. He led her forward, and she realized her endless days were over. Her real life had just begun.